Fateful obsession. The raw, frost-laden wind whined mournfully across the vast parking lot outside the Waterbury, Connecticut. War planned as Anthony C. Parker, a night shift typesetter, left his work and walked toward his parked sedan at the edge of the lot. However, the cold wind was no bleaker than the bitter chill that penetrated the heart of the middle-aged workman as he started for his lonely home on that November morning. Tony Parker knew that his young, fun-loving wife would not be home to welcome him with a warm breakfast. He knew that their 2 children would be getting up that morning in the homes of strangers. Neighbors had taken them in when Tony's wife left him months before, after many violent quarrels and misunderstandings. As Parker approached his small sedan, he noticed that it had been moved from the place he'd left it the night before, and immediate suspicion entered his mind. Had Stephanie taken the car again without his permission? More than once during recent weeks, his attractive wife had come to the plant while he was at work and taken the car for joyrides with other men. It was those joyrides that had led to their final split-up. The voluptuous, 28-year-old girl of Lithuanian extraction he had married 9 years before, when she was just past 18, had, from the beginning, been attracted to other men. 3 years ago, shortly after the birth of their second child, she had openly demanded her freedom. Stephanie was perfectly frank about it. She didn't object to continuing her marriage to the older Tony, but she insisted on being allowed to go out with younger men at the same time. For a while, Tony had put up with it, hoping that she would tire of the wild life she was leading and return to her duties as a wife and mother. But things had not worked out that way. Instead, Stephanie had become ever more neglectful of her little family. 6 months before, things had come to a head when Tony threatened to divorce her. She took the children to the home of relatives to be cared for and went to live with a woman friend in another part of the city. Since then, Tony had seen his attractive wife often but had not been able to persuade her to return to his little cottage at the edge of the city. The best he could get was assurance that the parties she went to with other men were innocent of any real wrongdoing. But she refused to come back to him until he agreed to let her continue her friendships. Now, as the disconsolate husband approached his car, he realized that Stephanie must have been using the machine while he was at work. His suspicion was heightened when he saw a late edition of a Waterbury newspaper lying on the front seat. That paper hadn't been out when he'd parked the car there the evening before. Tony also noted that the blanket he kept in the back of the car was missing. The keys, which he always left in the car for emergencies, lay tossed carelessly on the seat under the steering wheel. As he drove home, he vowed to call the house where his wife was staying and have it out with her about taking his car on her parties. A few minutes after 7 o'clock on the morning of November 2nd, the telephone rang in the home of Miss Annabella, some 2 miles from the Parker cottage. "I want to talk with Steffi." The man's words came harsh and rapid, and Miss Annabella realized that her friend must have been having another row with the husband from whom she was separated. Her own voice was sympathetic when she replied, "I'll have her call you back later, Tony." The girl hesitated to tell the irate husband that his wife hadn't been home all the night before. Things between them were bad enough as it was, she knew. "Listen, Anna, if she's asleep, wake her up. I want to talk with her now. If she won't come to the phone, I'll come over there and have it out with her." There was a long minute of silence, and then Tony Parker heard her say, "But she's not here, Tony. She didn't come in last night, and I thought she might have gone back to you. It's the first time she ever stayed out all night without letting me know." Tony's anger was gradually being replaced by a sensation of apprehension. It was true enough that Stephanie liked a good time, enjoyed staying out late with the gay friends whose company she found so much more interesting than his. It was also true that she had borrowed his car before. But in the past, she had always left a note inside, mentioning the fact. Parker finished his breakfast and thought about retiring, but he knew sleep would not come until his mind was at rest. He went outside the cottage, determined to make a closer examination of the car. Picking up the newspaper, he noted again that it was a late edition, which meant that it had been left there sometime between 7:30 o'clock the evening before and morning. He glanced at the fuel gauge and saw that the gas tank was less than a quarter full. When he parked the car Wednesday evening, it had registered 3/4. That meant that the car had been driven more than 50 miles. As the man's eyes shifted from the dashboard to the front seat, he noticed a dark, congealing pool of a sticky substance on the plaid-covered seat beneath the spot where the paper had been thrown. A closer examination brought a sickening, pungent odor to his nostrils. He recognized the smell of blood, and his face went white as he recovered the newspaper, turned it over, and saw the crimson stains where it had rested on the cushion. A moment later, he ran toward the home of his neighbor, Patrolman Francis Zukauskas, whose backyard adjoined his. Zukauskas, a popular member of the Waterbury police force and a friend of the Parker family for years, was sought for advice before formal action with the authorities. Officer Zukauskas, though he had missed his scheduled duty the night before due to illness, left his home immediately to examine the car after Parker's story was recounted by his wife. She had met their neighbor as he came running up to the house. A single look at the soiled front cushion confirmed the policeman's suspicion that blood had been spilled there recently. He was aware of the troubled marital relations between the couple, and upon learning that Stephanie had not returned after presumably taking the car the day before, he suggested calling the police headquarters. However, being on a temporary appointment, Zukauskas hesitated to assume the responsibility. While waiting for detectives, Officer Zukauskas phoned Miss DeBella and discovered that the missing woman had left at about 3 o'clock the previous afternoon. "She told me she was going to see a male friend," the girl explained. "But didn't mention any name. It could have been any one of a dozen men. She had a lot of friends and frequently went out with them in the afternoon." "Do you know when she'd return?" questioned the officer. "No, but we'd spoken about what we would have for dinner, so I'm sure she planned to get back early. I had to step out for a while around 6 o'clock, and when I returned, she wasn't here. I thought she had probably called while I was away and, receiving no answer, went someplace else for supper." After Zukauskas finished speaking, he found Detective Sergeant Joseph McCarthy and Detective George McElligott talking with Parker. A moment later, they were carefully examining the automobile. Scrapings were taken from the cushion, and fingerprint experts were called to check for prints left by former occupants. Parker mentioned that the car had been washed the morning before, and since then, to his knowledge, no one had been near it except himself and Officer Zukauskas. In the meantime, Miss DeBella reported finding Mrs. Parker's suede handbag in her bedroom, containing the missing woman's engagement and wedding rings and close to $50 in cash. "Steffi probably carried only her change purse when she left the house," the woman reported. "She must have been planning to return. She told me Tony had given her some money to pay for the children's support, and she wanted to get the matter attended to last night." While examining the car, the detectives found 2 tiny holes in the rear of the front cushion. They believed these holes were made by small-caliber bullets. The material was cut from around them and sent, along with the blood scrapings, to the police chemical laboratory for analysis. Over the next 24 hours, a search was conducted for the missing woman in places she frequented, but no one had seen her since she left Miss DeBella's home. A description of the Parker car was broadcast, and anyone who had seen it the night before was urged to come forward. On Friday morning, the laboratory report confirmed that the stains on the seat cushion were human blood, left 6 to 8 hours before discovery. The material around the bullet holes showed traces of powder marks, and experts testified they were made with .32 caliber bullets. The car itself had 3 distinct sets of fingerprints. Those left by Parker and the uniformed officer were easily accounted for. The third set, from a smaller hand, matched a set of the missing woman's fingerprints on file with the federal immigration authorities. By the end of the day, it was confirmed that Mrs. Parker had been in the blood-soaked car on the night of her disappearance. Upon receiving this information, the police expressed their conviction that she had been murdered, and her body disposed of. They based this belief on the substantial amount of blood spilled in the car, seeping through the seat cushion. In the rear seat of the car, behind the cushion, a small linen handkerchief was discovered. Both Parker and Miss DeBella denied recognizing the article in Stephanie Parker's possession, leading the authorities to conclude that another woman might have been in the car at the time of the crime. Mrs. Parker had been wearing only a light overcoat when she was last seen. Her overshoes were still at her friend's house, therefore, the police believed she had planned to remain out for only a short time. Chief Inspector Joseph R. Bender personally took charge of the investigation and, following a conference with State's Attorney William F. Fitzgerald, instructed his men to prepare a complete list of every man known to have been seen in the woman's company within the past few months. He was convinced that the crime had been motivated by jealousy on the part of one of the many suitors. "The man we're looking for probably lives right here in Waterbury," Bender suggested after questioning Parker at length. "In the first place, the woman hasn't spent any time away from the city, and secondly, if some out-of-town person is responsible for her disappearance, he'd hardly have brought the car back and parked it for her husband to find the next day. But there was that missing gasoline, someone drove the machine at least 50 miles on the night of her disappearance," countered Detective McElligott. "Well, if someone did kill her and do away with the body, he'd certainly have taken it a distance from her home to dispose of it," replied Inspector Bender. "In any event, once we round up every guy she's chased around with, we should have little difficulty in checking their alibis for that night." And I'll want to know which one of them possessed a .32 caliber revolver. Which ones had automobiles of their own and which had to depend upon her for transportation to and from their rendezvous. The husband said that he had cleaned out his car at the time it was washed on the morning of November 1st, and was thus sure that the handkerchief found in the back seat must have been left there after that time. Had this belonged to another woman, as now appeared to be likely, Inspector Bender theorized that at least two persons had been with the missing Mrs. Parker the night she disappeared. He believed it improbable that she would have sat in the front seat alone, while a second person occupied the back seat. Questioning Miss DeBella once more, he learned that Stephanie Parker had virtually no other women friends. It was also extremely unlikely that she and her boyfriend would have gone riding accompanied by some other couple, since she had been forced to keep her affairs with other men as secret as possible because of her marital situation. Anna DeBella's whereabouts from Wednesday afternoon until Thursday morning were thoroughly checked and proved that she could not have seen her friend after 3 o'clock of the day she disappeared. Parker's story was also checked carefully as a matter of police routine, and there could be no doubt that he was telling the truth when he said he had not been away from the factory after arriving there to go to work at 3:30. Detectives McElligott and McCarthy late Saturday dug up one fact that proved highly interesting to the inspector. While questioning residents in the vicinity of Parker home, they learned that a few minutes after sundown on Wednesday night, a car believed to be Tony Parker had driven up to the side of the house, between 7:15 and 7:30 o'clock. A woman who might well have been Stephanie Parker, it was too dark and foggy to see clearly, got out and started yelling, they were told. "Calling someone?" suggested the detective sergeant. "Did you hear any name mentioned?" He was informed that the woman had shouted for someone to come to her car, calling the person addressed a dirty schlemiel, a foreign word meaning dope. The informant said that she had not listened longer. Sometime later, however, this woman had heard the sound of arguing from the direction of the Parker backyard. Parker himself said that, to his knowledge, no one had been near his home during his absence, and he was the only person who had a key to the place since his wife had left him. Continuing their investigation in the neighborhood, the detectives went to the home of Patrolman Zukauskas, directly to the rear of the other house. There they questioned the policeman's wife, who told them that she had been home all day Wednesday with a sick child. Later, her husband had come in and gone to bed with a cold. That was at just 7 o'clock, and Edna Zukauskas then went out to a neighborhood store for food for supper. The policeman's wife had heard no commotion while she was at the house. Detectives returned to headquarters to ask her husband if he had heard anything of the supposed commotion, but Zukauskas said he had been in bed with a splitting headache and heard nothing. Zukauskas added 2 names to the list already compiled of suspected boyfriends of the missing woman. He said that he had known the Parker family for several years and that the husband had frequent quarrels with his wife because of her chasing after younger men. One of the men named by the patrolman was known to possess a .38 caliber revolver. He had told the officer on the day after the disappearance that he had to leave the city to find a job in a neighboring town. He had not been seen since in Waterbury. "Did this fellow ever admit to you that he was running around with your neighbor's wife?" asked Inspector Bender. "Not only admitted it but asked me to follow her and another guy out to a spot on Lover's Lane several weeks ago and take notes on what I saw them do there. He said the woman was two-timing him, and he wasn't going to stand for it. You'd have thought he was her husband himself, by the way he acted." "And you obliged him?" asked the inspector. "Yes, I found her out there necking the other fellow and warned my friend he'd better stay away from her after that." Bender, thinking of the .38 caliber gun which Officer Zukauskas had seen in the suitor's possession, was aware that the laboratory technicians who had examined bullet holes in the car might have been mistaken in their conclusions. He thought also that it was strange Zukauskas had not heard that argument not 100 feet from his bedroom window. Zukauskas himself must have been pretty familiar with the woman and her clandestine affairs to have volunteered to make that Lover's Lane expedition, Bender concluded. Wasn't it possible, he wondered, that Zukauskas had done his snooping because of some more personal interest in the case? He turned to his man and suggested thoughtfully, "You know, the boys may be wrong about that being a .32 caliber revolver." As he spoke, Bender withdrew from his desk the seat cover in which the 2 bullet holes had been discovered. He asked the others to follow him and went to the basement of the building where a shooting gallery had been rigged up for use by the police. There, he turned once more to Zukauskas. "Got your service revolver with you?" He referred to the .38 police special that had been issued to the patrolman when he was taken on the force in a temporary capacity the year before. Zukauskas nodded, and the inspector asked him for the gun. The next moment, he fired a single shot through the seat cover. "That ought to tell us if a .32 was used," he said easily. Zukauskas agreed eagerly, and the two of them bent forward to study the hole. Inspector Bender had brought the pieces cut earlier from the seat cover and containing the other two holes. Even without the aid of measuring instruments, it was instantly apparent to both men that the bullets which had made those first two holes had been considerably smaller in caliber than that fired from Zukauskas' revolver. "Well, that should pretty well clear your friend with the .38, Bendler said evenly. "Unless, of course, he had another weapon." Following the bullet hole test, the inspector called the two detectives. For several hours, he went over the list of names they had gathered and listened to the stories told by those questioned. A strange coincidence in the statements taken from all appeared to be that each man, while admitting readily enough that he had taken the woman out at one time or another, insisted on telling tales about her other suitors. Stephanie Parker, it appeared, had attracted the attention of a score of men other than her husband. In almost every case, there had been hints of jealousy, and yet among those questioned, all were able to prove that they were not near the woman on the night of her disappearance. Bendler realized that the only men whose stories he had not run down were those named by Officer Zukauskas. He gave the detectives their names and the name of the town to which the owner of the .38 said he was going to look for work. The following day, McCarthy and McElligott were questioning the man himself. They repeated Zukauskas' story of the revolver and asked to see the weapon. The man swore that he'd never possessed any kind of a gun. Questioned about the time he had supposedly asked the policeman to spy on his married girlfriend, the man laughed outright. "Asked him to spy on her," he repeated at last. "Why, you couldn't keep him from it. More than once Steffi told me he followed her when she took men in her husband's car for necking parties. The guy was crazy over her himself. But of course, living there right behind them with his own wife and kids, he had to keep it on the quiet. He was one of the few guys who wasn't even suspected by Tony Parker. You realize, don't you, what you're saying casts suspicion on one of the very policemen assigned to investigate this case?" asked Sergeant McCarthy gravely. "I realize that Francis Zukauskas was the man who had most to fear from Stephanie," the other replied, suddenly serious. "She threatened to expose him if he didn't stop chasing after her. He was insanely jealous of her, but didn't dare start anything for fear it would get out and he'd lose his job. And I realized that he was the one man who had the gun to shoot her with." "Zukauskas' revolver has been checked. It wasn't that gun that fired holes in the Parker car," countered Detective McElligott shortly. "No? Well, how about the .32 he had before he went on the force?" The detectives, after further questioning of the suspect, realized that what he said, if true, might well put them on the track to a quick and unexpected solution to the mystery. They were still further convinced when the man proved that he had left Waterbury early on the afternoon of the crime and could account for every minute of his time since then. Within another 3 hours, they were back in conference with Inspector Bendler and Prosecutor Fitzgerald. Early the next day, the inspector called at the Zukauskas' home. He timed his visit so that he arrived just after the patrolman had left for work. Edna Zukauskas, the quiet, home-loving young wife of the officer, met him at the door. An hour's questioning brought out the fact that on the previous Wednesday evening her husband had been absent from their home during 2 one-hour periods. Both times he'd said he was going out to get some fresh air. Mrs. Zukauskas said that her husband had owned several revolvers, but she was unable to tell the inspector where he might find them. They had disappeared within the past few days from the drawer where they were kept. As he turned to leave, Bendler, with an eye on the woman who was preceding him to the front door, stopped suddenly and reached toward the floor. When he rose, he held a small linen handkerchief in his hand. "Your handkerchief, Mrs. Zukauskas," he said. "Must have dropped it as you got up." The woman turned, not a trace of suspicion in her eyes. "Thank you, Inspector." She took the handkerchief and placed it in the pocket of her apron. As she took the handkerchief, the inspector saw her glance oddly down at it. Had it not been her own, she'd certainly have betrayed that fact by the expression in her eyes. That could mean only one thing. The handkerchief found stuffed down behind the rear seat cushion of the Parker car on the night following Stephanie Parker's mysterious disappearance was the property of Patrolman Zukauskas' wife. Back at headquarters, the inspector called Patrolman Zukauskas in off his beat and announced he had a few questions to put to him. Why, for instance, had he not mentioned the other revolvers he owned? Why had he said nothing about his friendship with the victim? For more than 6 hours, the inspector continued to grill the man, but it was only after he called in fingerprint experts that the other showed any signs of breaking. It was then that Bendler played his ace in the hole. "Francis," he said, "you're a policeman and you will be able to appreciate the value of laboratory findings. You'll be able to appreciate the fact that some of the fingerprints we found in the car were on the light switch. That means that the man who left them must have turned on the lights. Now, When Parker found his car where it had been left during the night, presumably by the person or persons responsible for his wife's disappearance, it was already daylight, and he had no reason to use the lights. Later, when he called you to examine the car, you naturally left prints on the door handle and in other places. But it was still daylight. Certainly, you'd have had no reason to touch the light switch. Why, then, have we found your fingerprints on that switch? When I talked with your wife this morning, she accepted the handkerchief found in the back of the cars belonging to her. Why did she tell us you'd been away from the house twice on Wednesday night after you clearly stated you'd been sick in bed that evening? Francis Zukauskas, since joining the department, had made a point of studying modern police procedure. He was the last man to fail to appreciate the significance of the evidence that had been piled up against him. But it was only when Inspector Bendler hinted that the young wife he had betrayed might be blamed for his own crime that Zukauskas finally broke. "All right, I did it," he said softly. "Let my wife alone. Whatever she did was only because she wanted to save the woman who broke up our home. Edna is completely innocent. Leave her out of this thing and I'll tell you everything. I'll take you out where I hid the body after killing her." The story that followed was one of the most bizarre ever heard by the veteran homicide investigator. It began on a night over a year before when Francis Zukauskas had attended a dance at the Waterbury Lithuanian Hall, where he was assigned as a special policeman. It was there he first met his neighbor's wife, Stephanie Parker. Love, or what the 34-year-old policeman took for love at first sight, blossomed. Their first night together marked the beginning of a passionate relationship. Over the subsequent months, Zukauskas' infatuation with the attractive, large-bosomed blonde grew. Discovering her infidelities to both himself and her husband, he became madly jealous and engaged in violent quarrels with her. Months later, Zukauskas' own wife grew suspicious, accused him of faithlessness, and threatened to expose him. A reconciliation followed, with Zukauskas promising to end his involvement with Stephanie. However, he hadn't considered Stephanie's persistent passions. She repeatedly called, threatening trouble if he refused to continue their affair. On the evening of November 1st, Zukauskas was returning home when Stephanie drove up behind him in her husband's car, demanding his company. "You're going out with me tonight, you schlemiel, or I'll tell everything to your wife," she cried, accusing him. "She already knows," he replied. "Okay, so I'll take my story to your chief. I'll get your job this time." Crazed with fear and anger, Zukauskas struck out, and a violent altercation ensued. The woman followed him, still screaming. Zukauskas pulled a small .32 from his pocket and ordered her to leave him alone. In his confession, Zukauskas stated, "The next moment the gun went off. I realized I'd shot her and fired once more, almost automatically. I thought of rushing her to the hospital. I managed to get her in the car. I must have dropped my wife's handkerchief in the car at that time. Next moment she had revived and started screaming I'd killed her. I must have gone completely crazy then. I reached for my revolver and emptied it into her body. She slumped down on the front seat. I still intended to take her to the hospital. But instead, I drove around for more than an hour. I knew then that she was dead. Finally, I stopped and undressed her, wrapped her clothes in the blanket I found in the car." Zukauskas returned to his home, told his wife to call headquarters, and say he was ill and wouldn't be able to take his duty. An hour later, he returned to the car, drove to a lonely country lane near the village of Middlebury, and dug a shallow grave. Before burying her, he smashed in her face to prevent identification if the body was found. On the way back to the city, Zukauskas disassembled the revolver and, along with the bundle of clothing, tossed it into a creek. In February 1945, Francis Zukauskas went on trial before a tribunal of 3 Superior Court judges, charged with first-degree murder. Although the man's lawyer admitted the crime, they argued for only second-degree murder, justifiable under the circumstances. After less than 3 hours of deliberation, the judges, however, sided with the prosecutor and sentenced him to die in Wethersfield State Prison 2 months later. Numerous legal steps were taken in an effort to save the slayer's life. On April 9, 1946, exactly 48 hours before his scheduled execution in the electric chair, the State Board of Pardons commuted the sentence to life in prison. Edna Zukauskas was completely innocent in the case and was cleared of any blame whatsoever. The end.